Okay, so the Americans occupied the southern half and the Russians occupied the northern half of Korea. And this time period has also been called the pressure cooker because of what led up to the division. So during the colonial period, there was a growing tendency by the Japanese to divide the left and the right within Korea because divide and conquer works better, right? If the left and the right were all combined, the independence effort would have been stronger. So Japan kept the left and the right, or tried to really divide Koreans along ideological lines. And throughout the wartime, there really wasn't a lot of freedoms in Korea. Although they gained many freedoms before then, starting with the Pacific War, which actually began before Pearl Harbor in Asia. So during that time, that's when Koreans lost their rights to speak Korean in public. They had to change their names. All sorts of these things happened during the Pacific War. Now, what happened as a result of the colonial period? There are a lot of legacies. Like, for example, we'll be talking about comfort women and military sexual slavery today, but also you may be familiar with some of the territorial divisions. There are actually hundreds of territorial divisions around the world. In fact, we even have some of them in the United States. But what happened was some of the territorial divisions, like Dokdo, the island on the east, off the east coast, that's disputed between Korea and Japan, and also the East Sea. Because remember, yesterday I was saying, what do the Japanese call the East Sea? Sea of Japan. And that's what, in fact, if you look at most maps, in English, it will say Sea of Japan. And Korea's been really trying to get the international community to change that and to call it the East Sea. Okay, so as World War II appeared to be ending, the Koreans formed a committee for the preparation of Korean independence. They were talking about how to transition power from the Japanese to the Koreans. However, the Americans and the Russians decided instead to divide and jointly occupy the Korean peninsula, dividing it at the 38th parallel. They decided this in the night of August 10th going into the 11th. The Koreans, nonetheless, decided to form their own government. They called it the Korean People's Republic, but it was not recognized by the United States. The United States said, well, they're going to jointly occupy the Korean Peninsula, and they also did not recognize it because they said it's too leftist, because it's got the word people in there. So instead, but really, what the United States and the Soviet Union both wanted to do was just occupy. And again, it's not just Korea, this happened in Germany, this happened in Vietnam as well. And this joint trusteeship had been discussed earlier at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, and we start to see the Cold War happen. Now, the reason why Russia was given the top half is because Russia entered the Pacific War in the very final days. So at that time, the United States, had developed the atomic bombs, but they didn't know if it was really going to work for sure. So they were going to drop the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but just in case it didn't work and war was prolonged, the United States invited Russia to enter the war. So Russia did at the very end. So, ironically, or different than what we might have expected, the Russian occupation in the north was a lot more free. They weren't as heavy-handed as in the south. So they let people in the north form people's committees, at the village level, and they were given a fair degree of autonomy. It doesn't mean that they acted very nicely. In fact, many of the people's committees really went after landowners and targeted them, executed them. There was a lot of scapegoating going on. And in the north, they exercised land reforms, and a lot of the big factories had been up in the north, and they nationalized those. So whoever owned them, they lost their ownership. And labor reforms, because they were establishing a communist country. And they had supposed gender equality, but really was not equal. In the North, though, despite the seeming freedoms, there really was a lot of control and surveillance, and a lot of people ratted out their neighbors, their enemies under this. So in the South, the Americans were very distrustful of Koreans because they couldn't tell who was who. So they couldn't tell a communist from a capitalist, so they were distrustful of many Koreans. And they basically continued the same kind of police state in the South that the Japanese had had. So the Japanese, in fact, as they were negotiating their exit strategy, the Americans said, "Why don't you stay on until we can figure things out?" And the Koreans said, "Are you kidding? We don't want that." So the American compromise in the South was, okay, how about if all the Koreans who currently work for the Japanese authorities stay and run things? And it wasn't great because, hey, they were called collaborators and traitors. But at least they were Korean, so that's what happened. So it was a strong police state. Anti-communism was the main thing, just the way in the, oh, you missed out on a door prize. Your name got picked, but you didn't get one. It went to somebody else. There's a heavy crackdown on leftists and suspected leftists. So a lot of what happened was really just very chaotic in that you had neighbor riding on neighbor quite often. Okay. And then leftist rebellions even in the South. Okay. So the two Koreas were divided in 1945 and 1947. The United Nations Commission, or a United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, urged Koreans to have an election. But the Koreans couldn't decide on one election. So they ended up having two separate elections, one in the North and one in the South. And this led to the formation of two separate countries, the Republic of Korea in the South and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North. What's interesting is that in the North, they claim to have had secret elections in the South. They said, because they weren't allowed to have these openly, they had like secret elections. And in both the North and the South, Kim Il-sung was elected. So North Korea claimed to have the only legitimate authority on the Korean Peninsula because they said the South only had elections in the South, so it's not as legitimate. So that was their claim. So, but really the two sides ended up being quite similar in their strategies. So this is the former Japanese colonial government authorities, then it was the headquarters for the U.S. command, U.S. occupation, and then it became the headquarters of the new South Korean government. Now, then I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the war. You know that yesterday was the 68th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. However, if I can contradict myself, the Korean War didn't actually begin on June 25th, 1950. It also didn't end on July 27th, 1953. Now, the Korean War is really complicated. Technically, the United States never actually declared war or went into war in terms of an act of Congress. So some people say it's actually a Korean conflict as far as the Americans are concerned. And why is that relevant? We'll talk about it in terms of normalization. Okay. So why I say it didn't begin on June 25th is that from 1948 on, there were these guerrilla fighters, so in South Korea. So the guerrilla fighters are communist or communist sympathizers, and they are living literally like in the hills because they've been chased out of the towns. They're in Jeju, on Jeju Island, which we talked about before, and also in south part of South Korea. Now, they didn't have Soviet support or North Korean support, but they were, but they wanted to be allied with the communists. Also, the United States troops didn't, supposedly withdrew in 1948, but we know from all the things that happened today that there's leaving and then there's leaving. But there weren't many left. So in North Korea, The Soviets withdrew, actually they withdrew in 1947, that's a typo, not 1948, they had the land reforms, but there was a lot of fighting going on from summer of 1949 all the way until June 25th, 1950. And the reason for this, one of the reasons for this, is both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung wanted to control the whole peninsula. Also, let's see, if you remember your world history. 1949, which civil war ended? Yes, the Chinese Civil War ended. North Korea had sent troops to help in the Chinese Civil War. So the North Korean troops come home in 1949. They're restless. So they start having a lot of border skirmishes between North and South. Whoops, that got a little flattened out. But let's see, so this shows you some of the different areas of guerrilla fighters. So you'll see that there are many of them in this area. And so there were all these border skirmishes, and war seemed inevitable. Typically, you know, at night, one group of soldiers would cross over the 38th parallel to the other side, try to shoot up some soldiers, run back. Some of these skirmishes were bigger than others. But the war actually began on June 25th, well, the night of 24th going into 25th, 1950. North Korean troops crossed over and then crossed over on the very far west and then moved east. Now, North Korea likes to say that South Korea actually invaded the day before and North Korea was just retaliating, but there's a scene in a movie called Joint Security Area where this, it's a movie that takes place at the DMZ, and 2 North Korean soldiers and 2 South Korean soldiers end up becoming friends. You've seen it. Yeah. So in there's a line where the lower ranking North Korean says, but they started it, and the higher officer says, no, they didn't, actually we did. But the whole North Korean myth is, or North Korean thing is that the South Koreans had started it. Okay. So Bruce Cummings, professor of Korean history at the University of Chicago, said, civil wars do not start, they come. They originate in multiple causes with blame enough to go around for everyone. Missing the word go there. Okay. So what happened? War broke out on June 25th, and remember, Seoul is only 35 miles from the border. So it only took 3 days for North Koreans to completely take the city of Seoul. By the way, if you're interested in this time period, Ode to My Father is a good movie that talks about this time period on. Another movie that I really like about this time, but it's not for students, it's really kind of boring, is Taegukgi Brotherhood of War. And I've seen that, I think, on like Amazon Prime, Netflix, and those things. It's an older, slightly older movie. But it talks about 2 brothers, and one of the scenes that I like to show my students is actually just the second scene, which is June 24th, 1950. This family, they have really a great day. And one of the main characters, she says, I wish every day was like this, not more, not less. Everything was just great that day. But what happened really is, it was the last perfect day because the war started the next day. Have you seen that one too? Yeah. Good. Okay, so, get back. Okay, so on July 25th, Task Force Charlie arrived. Now, Task Force Charlie were American soldiers stationed in Japan, but they really weren't combat fighters. So they arrived in Korea, but they weren't able to be very effective at deflecting the North Korean troops. So by September, the South Korean troops, the American troops are really confined to a corner, a very small corner of the Korean peninsula. And it's in September 15th when MacArthur lands at Incheon. They called it Operation Chromite. There have been different movies about it. I think there was one maybe with Liam Neeson. And they cut off the North Korean supply routes, and that really changed the tide of war, and so the Allied forces were able to retake Seoul by the end of September. And at that point, the question was, were the Allied forces going to keep status quo, or were they going to cross over the 38th parallel? And MacArthur was very gung-ho, so they went across 38th parallel, yet as they approached the Chinese border, the Chinese got nervous and they sent troops to fight with the North Koreans. So Seoul was retaken, and then it took another 8 months, almost 9 months, for the Allied forces to retake Seoul. But all the way from there until the armistice was signed in 1953, the last 22 months of the war were really just, were bloody, but little land was gained either way. Has anybody seen MASH? If you're older, I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah, the TV series lasted more years than the actual Korean War did, or the fighting in the Korean War. But if you remember from MASH, a lot of it was just, by the way, MASH was filmed in the Malibu Mountains, or Santa Monica Mountains in Malibu. So what happened, like in MASH, is there's really it's just like they're saying, oh, got a bug out at the beginning of the episode, and then they leave, and then they come back. And there was one episode where what was his name, Corporal Riley. He had dropped his teddy bear, but then they found him because it turned out that they'd gone back to the exact same place they'd started out at the beginning of the episode. But it was kind of like that, where people were just, there was a lot of bloody fighting to take or retake one hill. Okay. So this shows you this says main route of Red Offensive, #1, and #2, UN beachhead at southeast of September 7th. So that is the Busan perimeter. By the way, if you want a little bit of trivia, have you heard of Train to Busan? Yes. It's, okay, even if you don't like zombie movies, you'll probably like this one. Koreans know how to cross genres. So it is a zombie movie, but it's so much more than a zombie movie. It'll have you laugh and cry and scream, like in the same minute. Okay, so one of the things you may remember from Train to Busan is how at the end the only zombie-free zone was right outside Busan, right? Remember that cave at the end, if you've seen it? Well, guess what? That is the Busan perimeter, right? So some people said, oh, that movie was talking about this same thing, about how, they had this safehold over Busan. Anyway, and then, whoops, sorry, not doing very well with this. Okay. So, #4, main route of UN drive back. #5, South Koreans at 38th parallel line on September 29th. #6, South Korea takes Kuna on October 18th. And #7, Allies enter Red Capital October 19th. So this is an old American Army map. That's why they say red and stuff like that. Okay. So this is the maximum North Korean control over the Korean Peninsula. And this is the maximum Allied control over the peninsula. So it was just in the first 14 months, first 15 months, a huge amount of shift. So the big turning points in the war was the Incheon landing by MacArthur, Operation Chromite on September 15th, and then Allied forces took the south, pushed past the 30th parallel, and the US and ROK were headed to the Yalu. The Yalu River is the northern border, so that's when the Chinese became nervous and entered the war in October. Some of the pictures. Now, more and more of this is coming out, but it turns out that there are also a lot of civilian casualties in the war. Some of them instigated by the soldiers because, as we're finding out, as far as, there were a lot of, Koreans committing atrocities against Koreans, but also the American army, and I'm sure the Chinese army as well, because war is war, on violence against civilians. So people being put into holes and being shot. Whoops. See the dead bodies. Mass graves that have been unearthed. This is what downtown Seoul, if you remember that building, that was the government headquarters. You see that in the background. You see how shelled out things look. I had a student here when I was a different Korean War vet, and he said he couldn't reconcile the pictures of Seoul today with what he saw in 1953. He was there at the very tail end of the Korean War, and he said it looked like there was nothing left intact. So the armistice was signed in 1953. Although the war had begun with the Koreas divided at the 38th parallel, it ended with the Koreas divided at the DMZ. Slightly different line, but basically same thing. But, you know, very roughly, about 1.5 million people died, 3 million were injured, 5 million people were uprooted. The consequences were huge. There were many displaced children, and some of them ended up being adopted abroad. Now, I know a Korean-American filmmaker. She was an adoptee, and she was born somewhere around 1960. But her family always told her, "You're a war orphan," and she was like, "Okay, I was a Korean war orphan." And then as she grew up, she's like, "Wait." She's a little too young to be a Korean War orphan, but that was the whole idea that was perpetuated. Okay, so the Korean War, another picture, and what happened? Oh, we're going to talk about North Korea now. So this is Kim Il-sung, young Kim Il-sung, old Kim Il-sung, and then that's his son Kim Jong-il, who you see here. So you know, oftentimes Kim Il-sung was referred to as the great leader. Kim Jong-il is the dear leader. Kim Jong-un really hasn't had a nickname that really stuck. The third generation, the grandson. Huh? Oh, wait, well. Yeah. I mean, that's not what they call it. Okay, so the Kim family is revered. They're deified. It's practically worship. So look at these huge statues. This is not trick photography. Have you ever done, or your students done the thing where somebody stands in the background and it looks like they're standing on the hand? This is not trick photography. The statues are that big. These North Koreans have not been miniaturized. It is that big. By the way, North Koreans, one of their big famous exports are gigantic statues. Yes?
Are some Jong-il the generational names?
Oh, well, sort of. So Kim Il-sung was his name, and this is Kim Jong-un, and the next one is Kim Jong-un, and then Kim Jong-un's brothers were named Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-un, and I forget the other one, Kim Jong... Ted? Ted, you're right, that's right.
What's the sister's name?
She doesn't use the tongue. It's Kim. Yes. Yes. Okay. So, the Qin Dynasty. You know, people outside of Korea say things like the Communist Dynasty or Communist Monarchy. So that was Kim Il-sung, the great leader. By the way, after he died, he was made eternal president. So he is president beyond life. And then there was Kim Jong-il. And Kim Jong-il had 3 sons. Kim Jong-nam was the one who was murdered, probably by his half-brother. And he was actually the oldest son, but illegitimate. So Kim Jong-il had a mistress, girlfriend, with whom he had the oldest son. Supposedly he kept Kim Jong-nam a secret from his dad, Kim Il-sung, for a long time. And he was going to be the heir apparent, but Kim Jong-nam got in trouble with his dad when he tried to take his sister and her kids on a trip to Tokyo Disney, but on forged passports. He got in a bit of trouble for that. And then the second son is this one, Kim Jong-chul, but what I've read in some account by a South Korean political scientist is that Kim Jong-chul was never the favorite, that his dad never thought he was fit to take over. And then there's Kim Jong-un over there.
That was poisoned by some people.
Yes. Okay. So, and then, yeah, Kim Yo-jong is the sister. You don't see pictures. Okay. So in North Korea, one of the biggest ideologies was called self-reliance, and they use the term 주체. And there's economic self-sustenance. It means that they don't rely on anybody outside. Political independence, national equality, that they don't rely on anybody outside of North Korea. Military self-defense, they don't rely on anybody. Is that the truth, though? No, it really has not been. So even when North Korea claimed to be very independent, they were very much relying on Russia and China. In fact, North Korea was really good at playing off Russia against China to get what they wanted. Okay, so in terms of the economy, the self-reliance, by the way, this idea of self-reliance is not unique to North Korea. This term, "juntae," is unique, but in terms of this idea of self-reliance, it's pretty common in post-colonial socialist countries to say that they don't want to enter a new period of, neo-imperialism. Okay, so North Korea had a lot of industrialization during the colonial period, and this, they still had it after 1945. They talk about the economic self-sustenance. And in fact, all the way until about 1970, North Korea was actually richer than South Korea. Hard to believe today, but that was the case. After 1970, the North Korean economy declined and South Korea followed a path of economic development. The PRC, the People's Republic of China, had what they called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And certainly North Korea tried to follow their own path as well. A lot of their economic problems really came after the Soviet Union fell and the Soviet Union wasn't propping up North Korea. 1992 was another important turning point because the PRC and South Korea normalized relations. South Korea suddenly became an investor in the PRC. And the PRC, although they're politically allied with North Korea, economically they want South Korea's money. And then since 1994, which coincides with the death of Kim Il-sung, by the way, North Korea has had a lot of food shortages, heating oil shortages, floods, droughts, limited aid, and limited trade, most recently because of the sanctions. Okay, so this is North Korea, the factories, farms, power plants. In terms of the culture, Kim Il-sung and the Kim family really is seen as the source of everything good. They are the sun. We all need the sun. Everything we need, life, everything comes from the sun. S-U-N. And this says, let's drive out the Americans and unite the fatherland, things like that. In terms of the education, the kids who are children of the party members have the red scarves there. And what do you notice here? This kid has the party scarf, right? Some of the other kids do. How do they look health-wise compared to some of the other kids? Yeah. Yeah. So this boy is actually wearing a Boston Red Sox sweatshirt. I don't think he really knows what that is. He could have, gone by way of China, a Chinese factory. It could have been, I don't know, donated aid. But what do you notice about his hair? Buzzed?
But also he is missing here.
Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of hair. He does have, bare patches, and it's also very light colored. Why is it light colored? He's not dyeing it.
It's malnutrition.
Yeah.
He looks malnourished.
Yeah, malnutrition. And you see how the kid right next to him, the party member's kid, looks chubby, like little kids should. Mm-hmm. And you've heard about the camps in North Korea. And in fact, that was one of the things that they were saying, hey, how come nobody's talking about North Korea's human rights abuses, in June with Singapore? Now, South Korea honestly wasn't that great and open either, though. Better, but only relatively. Okay, so Syngman Rhee was actually a very old president, if you see that. He was elected in 1948, 1952, 1956, and 1960. He exceeded term limits. He kept running. In 1956, he had his opponent in the presidential election executed for treason. So he won. Now, why treason? Because the national security law said that if you speak out against the government or the sitting president, you're committing treason. So how do you run for president? Oh, by the way, it's a little hot in here. Can we get the temperature lowered? I don't want people nodding off. Okay. And then in 1960, his opponent mysteriously died before the election. And in the vice presidential elections, they had a lot of ballot stuffing, where it was done openly. So honestly, it wasn't a great democracy either. So Syngman reestablished the first republic. In South Korea, every time they have a new constitution, they call it another republic. So they were on the first republic, and it was a national security law that really, gave the government very broad powers to crack down on opponents. Now, the 1960 presidential election, because of the irregularities, students started protesting, and the government ordered that troops shoot the protesters. This began because on April 12th, they found a high school student's body. He had been killed during the protests, and when they found that, people started demonstrating against the government. This was the April 19th student revolution. Koreans generally tend to call it by the date, like we say 9/11. So this is the 419 protest, and somewhere between 115 and 130 people were killed, 1,000 injured. It got to the point where the head of the martial law command put down his gun and said he's not going to shoot civilians anymore. And the United States told Syngman Rhee maybe he should step down. They offered him safe passage and retirement in Hawaii, where he went. So he resigned on April 29th. These are university professors joining the students. This is student protesters against the military there. And this is Syngman Rhee, his wife, and their dog. I want to call them Checkers, but that was not the name. Doesn't that kind of remind you of that picture of the Nixons leaving the White House? By the way, that is not Patricia Nixon, but notice something about her?
She's not Korean.
Yeah, she's not Korean. She was Austrian, Francesca Rhee. Also came out later that Francesca Rhee was telling her priest, a French priest, a lot of things, and then he was reporting into the French embassy, which then probably shared it with the Americans.
And was she helping?
Not on purpose. So after Syngman Rhee stepped down, South Korea had a new constitution, a new election, and they decided that they were done with powerful presidents. So they said, okay, the president's going to be basically a figurehead. It's going to be the prime minister who has the real power. So they elected Chang-myeon, who spent a lot of time in the United States. He was also known as John Chang. And Chang-myeon had also been the first South Korean ambassador to the United Nations. Okay, so the students started demonstrating again. They said, okay, let's reunify with North Korea. And many of the South Koreans got very nervous about it. They said, this shows that the party, the government are weak, and people became disenchanted with what was going on. And there's also, this was a time of economic instability in South Korea. So on May 16th, Park Chung-hee staged a bloodless coup. He took over the government. He didn't depose the prime minister or the president right away, but he was ruling the government through them, or past them, not through them. And Park Chung-hee's main reason was South Korea didn't need democracy and all of that at that time. What it really needed was anti-communist vigilance, so that North Korea would not invade. And remember, it's not just in Korea, this is the Cold War all around the world. Okay, so the coup was in May 16th. Chang-myeon, the prime minister, asked the United States for help, but the United States declined to intervene because they saw Park Chung-hee as a strong leader who controlled the army, who would be anti-communist. So Park Chung-hee set up a junta. He called it the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, which sounds really good, but it really was just a military junta. So in 1963, at the urging of John F. Kennedy, he ran for president legitimately as a civilian. He won, no surprise. 1967, re-elected. Then 1971. In 1971, it was a close margin even by the government's calculations. So in 1972, he had a coup in office. So he rewrote the Constitution and basically put himself in charge of the electoral body. So the electoral body is headed by the sitting president who picks the new president. So basically president for life. So that was the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic. It's a picture of Pak Jung-hee at the coup. They took over the city hall there, Pak Jung-hee. And one of the things that he, yes?
Sorry. When he said that he established like the president, was that in 72 or?
Yes, 72. Because he almost lost the 71 election, he thought it better change it.
But that's not considered a new republic.
Well, I think it was a new constitution.
So it would be.
Yeah, I believe so.
So is it a 6-year term? Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that Pak Jung-hee was pursuing is economic development because, as I said, South Korea was really economically, underdeveloped all the way through 1970. So and Pak Jung-hee had done a lot. We have to certainly give him credit for economic development, although many people I know say, yeah, but at what cost in terms of democracy? Anyway, there was a government bank in the Itaewon. Itaewon are these large conglomerates like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG, bringing them together. And at first they focused on more of the high labor, low cost industries like textiles, sneakers, but then they moved from there to heavy industries, set up free economic zones. Two important things that really helped bring money into South Korea was the 1965 Normalization Treaty between South Korea and Japan. So altogether brought in about $800 million to South Korea, and Pak Jung-hee used this to start certain industries like POSCO, which is Pohang Iron and Steel, shipbuilding, all these industries that really got their start at this time. Now, many people in Korea protested this, saying, we're selling out to the Japanese, they were our colonizers, because normalization meant to resume full relations with Japan. But nonetheless, it happened. In 1966, the Brown Memorandum, about $1 billion in total aid to South Korea between 1965 and 70. Initially, they sent 50,000 South Korean soldiers, altogether about 300,000. But it also gave South Korea businesses a big boost because during the Korean War, Japan had been suppliers. They supplied a lot of the resources for the war effort. And during the Vietnam War, it was South Korea that did that. Yes?
I'm sorry, who's Brown and who gave the $1 billion to Korea?
Oh, the United States. Brown was, I think, Secretary of Defense at that time, or Secretary of State, I'm not sure who it was. One of the cabinet members. Okay. So many Korean companies, in fact, Korean Air got its start back then. My father-in-law had gone to Vietnam as a civilian, as an employee of Handin, and was in Vietnam at this time. And Handin started out as a transport company, and today they are the parent company of Korean Air, and they also own that huge building downtown, the tallest building west of the Mississippi or something, mainly because they cheated with that big antenna on the roof. So 94% of Korean steel exports at that time went to Vietnam for the war effort. 52% of transportation equipment went to Vietnam. So South Korea also, as I said, received a lot of financial assistance, not only through these things, but also by sending all the soldiers to Vietnam. I believe combat pay for an American enlisted soldier during the Vietnam War was about $200 a month. So if you think of 300,000 soldiers, each there for whatever number of months, that's a lot of money that went into the South Korean government. Here you see a South Korean soldier with a little Vietnamese child that they are saving from the battlefront. So Pak Jung-hee, we talked about his coup in office. Yes, the Fourth Republic was established in 1972, and the name of the electoral body was the National Council for Unification. August 15, 1974 was the opening of the very first subway line in Seoul. The president, Park Chung-hee, was making a speech. His wife was killed by an assassin's bullet. Park Chung-hee stayed and finished his speech while his wife was taken to the hospital. Park Chung-hee himself was assassinated by his own KCIA director. This is a reenactment of what happened. So, KCIA, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. Well, separate. Well, it was a bullet intended for the president, but there was a first lady who ended up dying.
Korean divorce.
Well, actually, some people liked her a whole lot better than they liked him.
Do they know who killed?
Yeah, I think it was a North Korean.
Okay.
So 1970s, during this time, there was a lot of labor activism of women as well as in other groups. Urban Industrial Mission was a church that was very closely allied with labor unions, with workers. And there's a lot of, this is a time where we see the rise of labor activism, people, demanding rights. But the Korean government, South Korean government, was telling them that everybody needed to tighten their belts and just, make sacrifices for the good of the nation. And then as the nation became stronger, everybody would be better off. Okay, so after Park Chung-hee was assassinated, again, South Koreans were eager to install a democratic government, but Chun Doo-hwan took over in a coup in 1979. After he became president, he established the Fifth Republic, and he put a lot of people into these re-education camps. And through his presidency, we see the rise of labor activism, student protests, even religious groups, and the middle class got involved. And also the international community had their attention on South Korea as well, because they, the Olympics were coming up. People often see the Olympics as a democratizing factor. But things weren't all that easy. So May 18th, 1980, small number of students at Jeonnam National University in the city of Gwangju protested, and they wanted the end of martial law. They wanted the release of the dissidents who had been either imprisoned or placed under house arrest. And South Korea sent in paratroopers, more than 3,000 paratroopers, who brutally went after the citizens, after the unarmed citizens. Altogether, at that time, they were saying about 144 civilians were killed. Actual number today is believed to be around 230. Amnesty International initially thought 2,000 people had been killed. There was a lot of chaos and they weren't sure. And there's still discussion today about how they are looking, rumors of mass graves that have still to be found from then. But it was pretty brutal, and there have been a lot of movies about this as well. Initially, South Korea said it was a communist attempt. It was a communist plot. And so that's why they justified it with sending in the paratroopers. The citizens of Gwangju fought back, and they commandeered the city armory, and they took weapons from there and defended their city, pushing the paratroopers out. They sent in regular soldiers and retook the city. But it was a very bloody affair. And if you are interested in this, A Taxi Driver is a really good film from last year about this, A Taxi Driver. Okay, so some of the issues. People got very concerned about the U.S. role, because again, this was an attempt at democratization by the citizens. They appealed to the United States for help, and there were actually, also in the city of Gwangju, some Americans and foreigners there. And in fact, a professor I know was in Seoul when he went to Gwangju at the tail end of the Gwangju movement, and he also delivered a letter to the U.S. Embassy explaining what had happened and asking for American help, and he was told that he shouldn't have been there in the first place. So, you know, the U.S. role in terms of did they knowingly approve the paratroopers to be sent in to Gwangju, and why was the U.S. not supporting democratization? And so this was the start of anti-Americanism in South Korea. People, you know, became wary of what Americans really wanted. But remember, this is really, I mean, this is the Cold War. You know, my students nowadays have a hard time understanding how the Russians, well, maybe now they, in the last year and a half, they kind of get it. But, you know, they'd be like, I don't get it with the Russians. I say, well, think of, you know, the anti-Muslim sentiment right now, but it was Russia back then. And I said, every movie, every novel, spy novel, was all about Russia. So anyway, so some of the protesters got radicalized at this time. See some of the pictures.
Yeah, I've been trying to get some.
This is citizens after they took over the city. Some people in hospitals, dead bodies on the street.
Yeah.
And as I said, people of Gwangju appealed to the United States for help, but the United States declined to intervene again. It was about anti-communism. That Cold War sentiment was really the most important thing in the world. And, and instead, very first foreign head of state invited to the Reagan White House was Chun Doo-hwan and his wife. And then after Chun Doo-hwan came Roh Tae-woo. Roh Tae-woo was Chun Doo-hwan's military academy classmate, had helped him in the 1979 coup, and he was the hand-picked successor. But Roh Tae-woo won some points for himself by saying, okay, he is proposing these 8-point reforms like direct presidential elections, so no more electoral body, easing freedoms like freedom of speech, etc. And he said, and then he told the public that if his demands were not met by the sitting president, he would not run for president. So of course, the president, reluctantly accepted them, and that boosted his standing. Also, it helped that there were 3 opponents against him in the 1987 presidential election. So there were 4 different main candidates, and so Roh Tae-woo won, and he established the 6th Republic. But basically, it was more of the same thing. So how did democratization finally come? Was it because economic growth, eventually leads to democratization? Was it because students, intellectuals, workers, even the middle class, religious groups, women's groups, that they all joined in? Probably all of the above. So that's Roh Tae-woo, who became president. There were a lot of protests at this time, continued to move. Oh, this is a political rally for Kim Dae-jung. Look at the number of people who turned out. And then the Olympics were coming up. 1988, Olympic Stadium there. And then Kim Il-sung became president next. Kim Il-sung was another conservative. He had been one of the political opponents in the 1987 election, but still he was, from the same conservative party, more of the same, but some major changes. Now, it was under Kim's presidency that the 2 previous presidents were tried and found guilty of engineering the 1979 coup. But their sentence was commuted. 2 years later, they were found guilty on different charges of bribery, insurrection, and treason. Chun was given a life sentence. Roh was given a 17-year sentence, but Kim Dae-jung, the next president after that, pardoned them. Pardons are very big in the Korean tradition, or Korean government. So that's Notaeo Chanduan in their prison guard. And then during Kim Yong's time, he's the one who actually first talked about this globalization in South Korea. You know, we talk about the Korean wave and everything. In a way, that was his vision then as well. And he really won, but the end of his presidency was the Asian financial crisis, and especially South Korea was hard hit. The Asian financial crisis started with the Thai currency, Thai baht, falling in May of '97. A lot of difficulties throughout Asia. The financial crisis hit South Korea, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in December went to South Korea and gave a bailout package and also demanded changes as well. So IMF crisis. And then after that, I know I'm running very quickly, but I want to have enough time to cover current events. So Kim Dae-jung became president. He was a long-time opposition leader. In fact, he's the one who in '71, Park Chung-hee had barely won over. Same year, the Korean government, the Park administration, had Kim Dae-jung run over by a truck. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He was kidnapped in '73, held under house arrest under '79. The South Korean government, I don't know, what do you call it, operatives, actually took Kim Dae-jung out to the ocean to throw him overboard, but America, the American government intervened. In 1980, he was indicted for inciting the Gwangju uprising, even though he was in prison. He was supposed to be executed, but instead the United States took him in exile. He returned in 1985. But his election really signaled full democratization. Because of the Asian financial crisis, his primary concern was economic recovery, but he also pursued the Sunshine Policy of engagement with North Korea. He was the first South Korean president to meet with his North Korean counterpart. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And then the next president, Roh Moo-hyun, was a self-educated lawyer, also from the same party as Kim Dae-jung, and he continued the Sunshine Policy. He also had a summit in North Korea. You can see that Kim Jong-il there is looking not so healthy. He retired. There he is with his grandchildren, but he committed suicide. Not because of depression, but because in Korea, or in East Asia, suicide is also a form of protest, and he was being investigated for corruption, and he felt that was unfair, and also directed at his family members and former staffers, so he committed suicide, and that ended all the investigations. So these are people outside City Hall. It wasn't a public funeral, but they all gathered there. Now, North-South relations. Between '97 and '07, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun pursued the Sunshine Policy of engagement, but this also, came on coincided with some of North Korea's most difficult economic problems. So a lot of natural disasters and famine from '94 on, heating oil shortages, again because after the fall of the Soviet Union, North Korea lost Soviet support. Oh boy, a lot of things there. You have this, I'm going to skip over and just show you some other things. So, SixParty Talks, hosted by China, were an attempt to bring everybody to the table together. These had many rounds, but ultimately they didn't actually achieve anything. This is Lee Myung-bak, who was president from 2008. He had been chair of Hyundai Construction, member of the National Assembly, mayor of Seoul, and it was when he was when he was mayor that he also made that, I showed you that urban park waterfall. That was his idea. Other things, I'm going to gloss over a lot of this. 2012, this is when Kim Jong-un was newly in power in North Korea, and they came up with this Leap Day agreement where all these great things were supposed to happen. The U.S. was supposed to ship food, and then in April, North Korea went ahead with a missile launch that they called a satellite launch. Now, this is why I was very skeptical about whatever would happen this year. Would it be real? Would it hold? Because people were pretty excited back then, in 2012, that this would lead to peace. IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm gonna pass through this, okay. So some of the things that happened during Lee Myung-bak's presidency. A South Korean naval vessel was sunk, and they never quite figured out what happened. The South Koreans accused North Koreans. There's a lot of question about how this happened. Also, these what was called beef protests. Lee Myung-bak agreed to resume U.S. beef imports without conditions. The people, citizens protested until restrictions were put on. This was during the height of the mad cow disease. A lot of people, they were called communists for protesting. And then Park Geun-hye became president. She was the daughter, the eldest daughter of Park Jong-il. And people compared her with Margaret Thatcher, called her the Iron Lady. And things got much worse with North Korea during this time. Also, the Sewol ferry disaster happened. She was, there were a lot of problems with that. But really what undid her was what some people call Chaesun-sil Gate, where it was found that she and her confidant had coerced $70 million in donations, you know, more than half of it from Samsung. She was impeached and removed, and she's in prison. So this is the Kaesong industrial complex there. Moon Jae-in has been president the last 13 months, and let me show you pictures and talk about it that way. So that's Moon Jae-in. North Korea had 6 separate nuclear missile tests. They developed intercontinental ballistic missiles. South Korea put THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, there. But a lot of things happened this year. This was the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. North and South Korea entered again in the opening ceremonies under the unified flag. Kim Jong-un's sister and a very high-ranking North Korean official went to Pyeongchang. There you see Mike Pence and his wife were also there, but they didn't talk to each other at all. But Koreans, North and South, both were very heartened to see, you know, the level of camaraderie between Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. And then the two leaders of the two Koreas met again. There was a lot of, you know, people analyzed and overanalyzed every body, every gesture, every, you know, smile, and said, you know, that they were really getting along well, that Kim Jong-un was showing respect for his older counterpart, and you see his sister again. I don't know, I've heard rumors she's pregnant, I can't quite tell yet. And then they met again a second time.
Was that a new wife?
No, that's his one wife.
I thought he killed his wife.
No, his brother.
I thought he killed his wife because she like made some secret
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, you know, yeah. No, he's still there. And then you saw the Singapore summit, June 12th. They signed this agreement that was supposed to be so great, but it's kind of very vague. We'll see what comes of it. This is the statement. Okay. Now, South Korea, that's 11. I'm allowed to go to 11, right? 5 minutes? Okay. Cars, shipbuilding, semiconductors, electronics, K-pop, you know, the Korean wave, everything. So it went in different stages. 1980s, there was a lot of construction, then high tech, the Korean wave, more of the Korean wave, a lot of electronics. Since then, South Korea and North Korea, well, we talked about the Olympics, jointly entered the UN, they co-hosted the World Cup. And South Korea went from being a recipient to a major donor of the OECD. They hosted the G20 summit, the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Now, fewer than 10 countries have hosted both a Winter and a Summer Olympics. South Korea is one of them. I believe Beijing will be possibly the first or only the second city itself to host the same, because not that many cities, you know, have both a summer and a winter. And these pictures give you a little bit of sense of how South Korea developed. You see these houses. These are not the Hollywood Hills stilt houses that you may pass in your commute. These are, basically shanties. And this was the original Cheonggyecheon running through downtown, and they decided for economic development that they're going to get rid of those, drain it. You see the pilings going on, the shacks being removed, and then it became this. An elevated roadway, big bustling downtown, and then when Lee Myung-bak was mayor, he decided that, hey, they should reclaim it, and I have to say, he's not my favorite president, but as mayor, I do like that he made that into this. And at night, really looks nice. It's so, great to have a park downtown like that. Phones. Oh, I just heard somebody's cut-up go. Samsung, phones. So what's happening in North Korea? Well, remember, Kim Jong-un had his uncle. Now, I have to say, at least it wasn't his blood uncle, it was his aunt's husband. Executed. 2 women, nerve gas, killed Kim Jong-un's brother. I showed you again, the contrast of poverty with wealth if you're a party member, an elite party member. So this is a hotel, the Ryugyong Hotel in Pyongyang. They wanted to build this and finish this in time for the Olympics in 1988, which they told South Korea, hey, let's co-host. South Korea said, no way. But a political economist explained that they built this out of concrete and rebar, which is great. This is how we build our 4-story, buildings in LA, concrete and rebar. But you can't go up 100 floors with concrete and rebar because you will fall out of alignment. And that's what happened. They couldn't get the elevators through the elevator shaft because when it's crooked, they don't go. So what did they do? It lay there as an eyesore for years until they did this. They covered it with glass, looks more sleek, and look, they put the elevators on the outside that handles the elevator shaft mishap. Looks good, right? They brought in some foreign companies that were going to occupy it. Kempinski Hotel was going to run it as a hotel. Looks really nice, right? But look, inside, bare. There's nothing there, it's just a shell. So give peace a chance. So, all the things that happened leading up to the summit. North Korea does spend about a quarter of its GDP on the military budget, but it's still far less than what we spend. By the way, in the United States, we spend more than the next 7 countries combined. South Korea spends about 3% of the GDP, same for the United States. There are a lot of American troops in Korea because the war never ended. And in South Korea, every able-bodied male currently serves for about 21 months in the military. Should do these already. Okay, so what's going to happen next? We don't know what's going to happen with this, after the June 12th summit. They did not agree to normalization. They didn't agree, so it's, let's wait and see what happens. But certainly, what we've seen is that Moon Jae-in is not waiting for America to be the intermediary. Moon Jae-in has reached out time and time again. He's been meeting with Kim Jong-un, and I'd be interested to see if the 2 countries decide that they are going to normalize relations. South Korea actually didn't sign the Armistice Treaty, but they, if the 2 countries decide that they're going to normalize, the rest of the world will have to, acknowledge that. They're not going to be able to say, no, legally you guys can't do that. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. And Kim Jong-un, in fact, in his New Year's Day address, talked about his desire to pursue economic development. Because let's face it, he's already done the whole thing with the nuclear weapons, the ICBMs, the hydrogen bomb. Militarily, we know they've got the strength, so even if they denuclearize, they could probably do it again or do it in secret. But what he wants now is economic development, and And a political scientist who I really respect used to say, there's no way Kim Jong-un is going to do that because to open up North Korea to economic development like the PRC did or like Vietnam did would put himself out of business. But it seems to be that perhaps he will have enough support from his people to stay there. And you know, like he was educated in Switzerland. In fact, he spoke some English apparently at the Singapore summit. He certainly understood some of what was being discussed in English. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens to North Korea in the coming years. Okay, we're at 10 o'clock. Can I just take a couple of questions? Okay, questions, comments? Yes.
I was in South Korea in 2011, and I had gotten the impression from at least a subset of the people there that they didn't actually take North Korea's nuclear threat seriously, and that much of it was just the media over here overblowing it.
That may have been the case 7 years ago, but now that they've had 6 nuclear tests, I think it was a lot more, you know, yeah, it was definitely unrefuted, yes.
My question is more from the American side. My father, now deceased, was a Korean War veteran. And during his lifetime, he never really spoke about the war, but he worked with the Korean veterans for the United States to kind of see this as not a conflict, but a war. And he spent many years on that, and then he was also very actively involved with that group in getting the Korean War memorial. So my question is, how did the United States, was it a political thing, start seeing this more as a war and not a conflict? Because they seem to have had some issues with their own Korean War veterans. At least that's just anecdotal from my father's point of view, I guess.
Yeah, it's that technicality. Technically, Congress never declared war, the Korean War to be a war, so technically it's a conflict, but let's face it, it was a war. You know, we don't call it the Korean Conflict Memorial, it is the Korean War Memorial. So I think just, you know, in terms of, you know, that's a mere technicality. It really was a war. Certainly many people, you know, gave their lives, you know, were injured, or, you know, like in your dad's case, you know, gave his time, his, you know, to fighting in Korea.
He was very distressed about the time.
Yeah, yeah. Also, although, you know, I was at the African American History and Culture Museum in DC, and they said the Korean War was the first integrated war. Actually, despite that, what I heard from a gentleman who was African American and was a Korean War vet, he said the African American soldiers had their bridge to protect, the white soldiers had theirs, and he said there was still a lot of segregation even at that time. Integrated, but not really. Yes, you had a question, right? Did you have a question? No?
Oh, I was just saying, I was just going to add to what she said, because I was there in 2013, and I wasn't even aware that Korea had said they were going to bomb the U.S. when my parents and my great aunts and my uncles were like, I heard there are bombs falling around you, come home. And I'm like, what? So like all the international students for like about a week, we were all like kind of worried that we have to go home. And all of our parents were like, we'll come get you, like we'll send you a ticket. And all the Koreans were just like, eh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, within Korea, they tended to be a lot more, you know, blasé about it, because what else can you do?
When you were talking about the Soviet occupation during the Cold War, and in North Korea they were like much more open to letting the people have committees and autonomy. Was that because of the Soviets' like greater interest in what was happening in Europe and Germany?
That I don't know, but I mean, I think with the Soviets, it's like, at least let them think they're doing something at the very local level. The Soviets have full control at the higher level.
There are two precedents for reunification. Germany and Vietnam. What do you see? How could these societies that have been against each other for so many decades, what are the things that would unite them, that would allow some kind of confederation or something like that?
In fact, with Korea, I think that that's probably the route that they will take, some kind of confederation rather than full unification, because South Korea, after they saw the German example and what happened and the high cost on West Germany, South Korea honestly doesn't want that. They don't want to absorb the cost. Imagine, the 25 million North Koreans, or at least, many of them trying to come south. A confederation makes a lot more sense. And working, maybe eventually towards something, a single state, but certainly I think they're talking, they're really not talking reunification at this point. They're really, peace has to come before anything else, because it doesn't look like North Korea is going to have collapse. Remember in 1994 when Kim Il-sung was on his deathbed, I was at the Association for Asian Studies, they said 10 p.m. emergency meeting, let's talk about what's going to happen if, or when Kim Il-sung dies. Guess what? 24 years later, North Korea has not collapsed. South Korea has gone through many, many different presidents, so has America, but North Korea is still in the same hands, of the same family.
Wouldn't unification depend on the Kim family giving up power or giving it to collaboration? Because it would keep them out of business.
Yeah, or collapse.
Yeah.
So I don't think the North Koreans want that, the South Koreans don't. So at this point, I think some kind of a peaceful coexistence, maybe eventual confederation, and then maybe decades later unification. But it'd be really a gradual process, I think. Yes. Sorry. I think I'm okay. One more.
Given that there are a lot of North Korean refugees living in South Korea right now, what's the current political climate?
The North Korean refugees in South Korea weren't thrilled to see, especially in terms of Trump and how Trump hailed Kim Jong. Same man he called Rocket Man, said my button's bigger than your button or whatever, and then to turn to him and say, he's a great man or whatever he said, his accolades. Especially the North Korean refugee community was not happy about that because they've been pushing for the human rights abuses. Before the State of the Union address this year, Donald Trump had some North Korean refugees come to Washington, D.C. to meet with him, to talk about, human rights abuses in North Korea. And then here we are, complete 180. So yes, for the refugees, it is disheartening.